marketing co-leads for UCR Healthy Campus.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Gonzalez. I'm Carly Labrador. I just graduated in March. I'm a last marketing and communications lead.
Thank you.
So Andres, we're going to do a tag team thing.
I'm open, whatever you want. I think, just so everyone knows here, Dr. Lowe is the true expert. I'm just here to, I don't know, to support. No, I think one of the things that I'm really passionate about is communication. Make sure that we provide accessible and trusted information to our communities. And I don't think I've seen any other time when there's so much misinformation. And I think I've said it before, where we think about the 2000s as the era of information, and what we're battling is the opposite. Before we thought, okay, we're going to have all this information available at our fingertips, and no one should be in a void or in a silos in terms of access to information. And what we find is that we're battling more misinformation than anything else.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Gonzalez actually is in a better place to understand how to communicate these things. I'm basically the lab guy, so. But the other thing is, like, I've noticed in some of the other events that I've witnessed that people will ask questions, and I notice sometimes if you just have one person answering the question, they may not be answering the question that the questioner intended. So I think if we do the tag team thing, we can also maybe answer slightly different versions of the same question, and I think that might be valuable in communicating to different groups that are listening.
Absolutely, and I think it gives it gives the listener sort of various perspective of points of view from the same topic without being necessarily two different realities, just part of the same reality, just different approaches to it. So I think I think it's important. I agree.
Yeah, and we haven't disagreed on anything yet, so.
It's true.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much once again for joining us. And I guess another quick introduction now that we have more attendees here. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Nithya Laganda, and I am a fourth-year psychology student and also a marketing co-lead for UCR Healthy Campus. Thank you so much for attending this event. We are excited to host this webinar to elaborate and discuss the vaccine hesitancies we have in our community. Our goal is to educate the public on the facts versus the myths of the vaccines. We are here with two speakers who will be discussing this topic for today. We will also be recording this event, so do not feel comfortable. If you do not feel comfortable being recorded, please keep your camera off. Thank you.
Thank you, Nithya. Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Labrador. I was a fourth-year business student and a lead for the marketing and communications at Healthy Campus. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the planning committee. Melanie Romero and Ross French are Healthy Campus staff leads, and Chelsea Luong and Lauren Miramontes, who are managing the chat.
Thank you, Carly. And along with myself, Carly, and Nithya as moderators, my name is Neha Laganda. I'm a fourth-year public policy student and marketing and communications co-lead for UCR Healthy Campus. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Andres Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez is the Chief Medical Officer for UCR Health and an Associate Clinical Professor of Neurology at the UCR School of Medicine. I'd also like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. David Lowe. Dr. Lowe is a Senior Associate Dean of Research and Distinguished Professor of Biomedical Sciences. Welcome. The purpose of this event is to help attendees understand the risks and benefits of getting the COVID-19 vaccine in order to make an informed decision. There will also be a live Q&A portion at the end so that you can ask questions and share your concerns. Please type your questions in the Q&A box and we will try to get to as many as we can. Thank you.
I'd also like to take a moment to remind everyone to please remember the UCR's principles of community, as this is a safe space. We kindly ask everyone to be respectful of everyone's thoughts and questions. All right, now we're going to go ahead and get started on the panel discussion questions. So Dr. Lowe, many people are concerned about the time it took to create the vaccine and that it was rushed to be made. Can you explain the process of how the vaccines are made and address the issue?
Okay, well, thanks. That's a really good question. Having been involved in vaccine development in the past, we sort of joke about how a lot of vaccine technology hasn't changed in 60 years. It's just basically what we call find and grind. You just take the bug, you grind it up and shoot it in your arm. But in fact, we've come to understand so much more about the immune system. We've understand so much about how the immune system responds to infections and so on, so that the understanding of biology has made it possible to say if a disease came along and we needed to develop a vaccine, we know what to do. And the rest is really an engineering question. It's like, let's just synthesize that thing that we know we need to create. Because in the old days, it would take, it could take 10 years to develop a vaccine, because you don't know what component you need to include in the vaccine. You don't know what form, that you need to put together to inject and so on. And so we now presently have so much more of that information and so much better handle on the engineering part of the manufacturing and formulation that that was quite helpful in accelerating the development. The other thing is that because of the advances in basic biology discovery, is that in times when, for example, in the 100 years ago, when we had that pandemic flu that killed, say 50 million people around the world, at that time, we didn't even know how to isolate the infectious virus. And it took another 20 some years before they even discovered the virus that could cause the disease. Now, when you have a new disease that's been discovered, it basically took a week to not only isolate the virus, but to have its full genome sequenced. So all of those things combined mean that when you discover a new disease, you can identify the agent, have its full genome sequence, and immediately begin to identify the component that you need to use to create that vaccine formulation, and have the biochemistry and engineering to actually basically create big vats of the vaccine. And so the thing that actually took longer was the fact that you actually still, for safety reasons, have to test it and see that it's in fact safe. But the first part of the development of the vaccine happened pretty much as quickly as you might expect, based on what we already know about the biology and the immunology of how vaccines work and how the immune system works. So to me, it was quite fun watching that development, because it's like, yes, we found it, we know what to do, make it, and it's like, now we got to wait for the vaccine clinical trials and just make sure that it's safe.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. And I guess the follow-up question, do you see this vaccine being an annual vaccine that we'd have to take?
Part of the answer is dependent on what we learn about the evolution of the virus. So this virus, as many of these pandemic viruses, come from an animal reservoir. And somehow it mutated to the point where it that's the wrong word. It mutated to the point where it was capable of infecting humans. Now, that's not like a switch that you flick and suddenly it becomes an animal virus and a human virus. So it evolves in real time. And so what we are still learning is that as we've already seen with variants, is that it continues to mutate and evolve. And sometimes the mutations mean that it's a little bit easier to spread from one person to the next. What we still are learning, though, is how quickly those mutations continue to accumulate, so that it would affect the ability of the vaccine to protect us. So far, we're fortunate that all of the variants that have been studied so far do seem to be controlled by the existing vaccines that we have. So we will learn more about whether or not we're going to need the annual, just like the flu shot, we need a new flu shot every year. Maybe we'll discover that this virus will be changing fast enough that maybe when you go get your flu shot, your coronavirus shot will be part of the same thing. We don't know, and so we're still learning, because it's a year ago we were still just trying to figure out all of these things.
Definitely, that makes sense. I do have a question for both of you. Whoever would like to take this one on. This is more in regards to the concept of herd immunity, and if you can explain the concept of what it is, and also if individuals can stop taking precautions or limit the precautions they take after they've been vaccinated.
I can start, and maybe Dr. Loh can supplement. I'm trying to find a good analogy, and maybe Dr. Loh has one. But I think about, if you're a frog, and frog being the virus, and you on a lake, and you want to jump from lily pad to lily pad, and that's kind of like what people are. So if the goal of the frog is to jump through different lily pads, the more lily pads are there, the easier it is for him to navigate the entire lake. As people get vaccinated, those lily pads go down. And so at some point, the frog will fall in the lake and not able to jump again into another lily pad. That's kind of the way I see herd immunity. At some point, you want to move all the lily pads around the frog away from the frog to the point that the next jump is going to be in the water. And that's kind of like that's a good analogy that how herd immunity would work. The idea is you get enough people vaccinated or enough people with sufficient antibodies that the frog can no longer jump into another lily pad.
I love that. I hadn't heard that one before, but that's a really nice picture explaining that. Because my background is in immunology, one of the things just to put this into context, is one of the things we understand about the fact that humans have genetic variation. And that's a good thing, because when we think about infectious diseases, often they will, like say plague or tuberculosis, things can sweep through the population and just simply kill off a large number of the population. The ones that survive the plague, for example, could be said to have herd immunity because they all are the ones that managed to survive. Now, it may be that you end up having to kill off half of your population, and the ones that survive are protected because of the herd immunity, but you still lost half of your population. So one of the reasons I try to push people a little bit away from thinking, oh, we have to go to herd immunity, is that some people are of the approach that, okay, the way we get to herd immunity is just let everybody get infected. And I'm not a real big fan of that, because as physicians, the goal is to have people survive, and not just, even if it's 2% die, that's still bad news. That's not a successful medical approach. If herd immunity is to be achieved by letting everybody infected and let the people die who are going to die, well, I think that's kind of morally and ethically irresponsible. The only practical version of herd immunity is for everybody to actually get vaccinated instead of relying on an infection. And in the modern civilized world, the only way we've achieved real herd immunity is with getting all the kids vaccinated before they're allowed into schools, getting your flu shot every year. So I'm just putting that out there as that, if we're going to have a conversation about herd immunity, we have to think in terms of the fact that the only way we can really achieve that is getting everybody vaccinated.
Definitely. Thank you both, Dr. Loh and Dr. Gonzalez, for addressing that question. I think it's really important for us to understand the importance of the vaccine. Moving on with our hesitations, I guess the question that I have for both of you are how we can address individuals who are hesitant to obtain the vaccine since they believe that they are immune to the virus maybe. And if you both can give us examples of how you've been able to go about educating your family and loved ones who may have similar mindsets towards the vaccine.
So your question, I missed a portion. Are you talking about for people that are hesitant because they feel they're immune to the disease?
Yes, to immune to the virus, yes.
Okay. I think this fall under the category of misperception or misconception or maybe maybe misinformation. One of the things that we usually go back is what's at the core of that of that belief. Is it because it's just a belief, or is it based on something that they read or something that someone else that they trust told them? You always want to, at least on the medical side, you want to look at the root cause. What's the root cause for that individual? Is it again someone that that he or she trusts told him that that's the case, or is it something that he or she read and you can actually drill down and share with him that information and look at it and see where you can make some modifications and change the understanding as to where the misperceptions may lie. So that's usually my perspective.
I think this is always a challenge with people who have concerns, questions, hesitance, and things like that. And there are studies that have actually said that if you try and flood people with here's the data, here's the science, you can actually turn people even more away. It's kind of like, are you calling me stupid? That sort of thing. It's like, no, that's not really the intent. I think one approach, regardless of where people are coming from, is saying, well, just directly talking to the person and saying, well, what are your concerns? What do you think is the problem? What do you think could happen? And really address, and just helping people realize that people are going to have nervous thoughts or concerns or whatever it may be, and just letting them voice those concerns and see whether there's a way to actually have a conversation about them. Because in some cases, the answer is just simply having the conversation and not flooding people with, here's the science, here's the data, things like that. That may be important just to help people go through that process internally and decide, well, what are the issues that they may have, and just hearing it out loud may be sufficient to really give that chance to work through.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess denial for the vaccine kind of leads or stems from being scared of the virus and the vaccine itself and side effects and things like that. Would you both give us an example of how you've been able to educate your family and loved ones?
Oh, Andre.
You want to go ahead, or you want?
Well, it's funny. My family knows that I've worked on vaccines and I've given seminars and things like that. And so we've had discussions. I haven't had as many situations where I've had to convince somebody. I think people have watched with interest the kinds of things that I've been doing and communicating. I think that the concern is more with people I've come across, not necessarily family members, but people who have questions and concerns. And as I've said earlier, it's like part of it is saying, well, this is what this is what has been exciting to me about how the vaccines were developed. This is what's been interesting to me about how, as medical school, as physicians, what are our concerns in terms of serving the community. Those aspects, as well as what I said earlier, is asking people what are their actual concerns. And are they really about the vaccines? Is it about the disease? Is it about some other social aspects of it? So each person is different and may have different kinds of things that need to be addressed.
Yeah, similar to Dr. Lowe, I didn't have that many people from my family not, being hesitant about vaccines. I think they saw it, as a frontline worker, they saw it that, that I wanted to protect myself and my family, and they saw the importance of. And they saw a lot of people also in the front lines dying from it, and so when I moved to get the vaccines, I didn't have anyone call me and say, "Hey, why are you doing it?" or "You shouldn't be doing it." Everyone was like, "Oh yes, please do it." Um, I think for other members of the family, as I think they just asked me like general questions about the safety of the vaccines and what I thought about the the recent articles that would come out, and so I would try to stay up to date and give him the latest information that I had, understanding that, I would tell him this is an evolving area, and, we don't have the answers to all of them. There were so many good questions, and to this day, we still don't have a lot of answers. I think Dr. Lowe had mentioned that as well. So that's typically the approach. What I would find is probably the hardest part will be that I will find people that are friends or friends of friends who, think that, we shouldn't be, we don't really need the vaccines. And so, what I know that I cannot solve everyone's hesitancy, but what I would do is those people that were close to me, I would, spend some time with them and try to understand where they were coming from and see if I could have the conversation, like Dr. Lowe says. It's a conversation that goes into, you drill down into what is it that is they're concerned about, and that's where you begin.
There's another aspect of this that I think is also interesting, is that we also have people I know who are on the other end, where the fact that this is such a lethal disease is a concern, where people are, really paranoid about everything. It's like, you can't do this, you can't do that. Because at the same time, the fact that we do have vaccines, the fact that they are effective, the fact that we've learned so much about how it's transmitted also gives us reason for optimism in terms of how we open up the community, how we open up businesses and restaurants and things like that, that we also need to take certain comfort in the fact that the science is telling us that we can open up, that we can safely go back and open up businesses and things like that, as long as we are paying attention to things like, yes, we still need to wear masks, we still need to get our vaccines, but you can now go to restaurants under certain conditions, you can go grocery shopping, you can take walks outside. There are a lot of things that you can do. So there's that other part of the community that we also need to comfort and address their concerns.
And one more thing I was going to add. I think one of the biggest aspects that I see from vaccine hesitancy is in part because of privacy laws that relate to patient care. If getting infected is it's the same thing as seeing a traffic infraction, people will be really aware of what goes on in terms of infections and COVID evolution. The reason why I'm saying this is because when you're in the medical field, when you work in hospitals, you see the impact, the significant impact that the virus had in the health system. You see it in the faces of the nurses, in the faces of the physicians. You see it in the everyday activities, and you see it in the at the end of a call schedule. And this particular circumstance is really completely unknown to the public. I tell people sometimes, like, if you only spend a few minutes of, half an hour in one of the ICUs, I'm sure your perception would have changed a little bit. And I think that in part it's because of our own protections, right? We have all these protections in place for our patients and for privacy that are, properly in place. But I think that also aids to the idea that, something is happening out there, but the only thing that I'm being affected is I can now go outside and go to the mall. And that discrepancy, that gap creates increases the hesitancy in so many ways.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. I think the fact that the vaccine and everything is so novel is definitely an addition to the fear factor. We kind of wanted to move on to address one of the vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine pause. We understand that some of the UCR community have gotten the vaccine and they're a little bit concerned about the blood clots and the distribution of it all. If you can address how the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is affecting people.
Yeah. So again, this is one of those evolving things. What my understanding is right now is that it's a precautionary pause. The pause is because of an unusual blood clots that occur, and they're very unique blood clots because they're similar to something we call heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. So if you think about thrombocytopenia, that's when your platelets go down. If your platelets go down, you're supposed to bleed. You're not supposed to clot. But there's this like an immune response that's similar to that heparin-induced thrombocytopenia that forms clots and low platelets. Still under investigation, I don't think I've encountered a good, reasonable explanation as to why it's occurring. It is occurring at a very low rate, so they're considered a very rare event. And I think it's still under evaluation. There's something similar that has occurred with the AstraZeneca, kind of similar blood clots. It's one of those things that we have to look at it, and we have to do the precautionary pause and see if this is, at some point we have to think about the risk-benefit ratios, which is something we consider in medicine all the time. If you have a stroke, I'm going to put you in a blood thinner, and the blood thinner might make you bleed, but I have to make that decision. Do I run the risk of having you have another stroke, which could be devastating, or the low risk of having you bleed, which is a risk? But at some point, collectively, we probably have to come to terms with the decision that we move it forward, and if we move it forward, understanding that there's a risk-benefit ratio that we have to take into account.
This is definitely still undergoing review, and it's possible that they may release the J&J vaccine, I think, by Friday. You can play with the numbers and note that, for example, in this country with the J&J, the incidence of the clotting events is less than 1 in a million, and so that is low. I mean, the 1 in a million is a low frequency, and you don't want to talk about it like what are your chances of being struck by lightning or having an accident in a car, things like that. But the real issue is that if you do get infected with a virus by not taking the vaccine, the consequences, maybe there is better medical care and you may not die, but there are longer term consequences from having an infection that are serious. So I think, in Europe too, the incidence with the AstraZeneca and J&J is a little bit similar. It's a very low incidence of this rare clotting event. And I think what's going to likely happen is that because it is an unusual phenomenon, that there may be some guidance. So just like when there was a low incidence of this allergic response to hypersensitivity response to the Pfizer and Moderna, basically the guidance has been, well, okay, after you get the shot, sit for 15 minutes. and see if you have an immediate hypersensitivity, or if you're likely to have some predisposing conditions that may make you more likely to have an allergic reaction, sit for half an hour, right? And so the guidance is to say, well, for all of these extremely rare events, let's just make sure that if that is a possibility, that we take precautions to be aware that you can handle it in a timely manner. But it is these are such rare events that the benefits far outweigh the low probability chance of this happening. Now, this is certainly something that's been, very low frequency happening in all the other vaccines that we see, all the childhood vaccines, all of the adult vaccines, whether it's the the flu vaccines and things like that. So, for example, people are told not to take certain flu vaccines if you have an egg allergy, right? So there's always these low probability, but occasional incidents where there can be a reaction. So the fact that we do take such care to do safety testing and monitoring, even though tens of thousands of people were tested in the initial safety studies, we still had been doing this monitoring in what's called the phase 4, so that even if a 1 in a million event occurs, somebody's watching out for it. So that's some reason to be quite comforted that people are paying attention to these things and looking for ways to make sure that if such extremely rare events happen, that there's a way to take care of it.
Thank you both. I think it's great that we're addressing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and I think another hesitancy was about the side effects of Pfizer and Moderna, and just the general effectiveness of each vaccine. If you can address the side effects, and I guess why it's important to look out for vaccine boosters.
Yeah. So side effect. I mean, when I think about vaccines in general and some of the adult vaccines, the side effect profile for both Moderna and Pfizer are relatively low. I mean, you have things like that are very common that like you have over 50% of arm pain. Well, that's fine. It's not a big deal. That means that you get a vaccine and you get a needle in your arm with some liquid. And there's other side effects that, from my perspective, like there's the fever and the chills and the body aches. I just think about what someone said from one of the earlier studies. There was a physician who was part of one of the earlier studies, and he was blinded, so he wasn't sure whether he was on the placebo or the vaccine arm. And he got fever, chills, and body aches, and he got excited. He's like, "Oh, I'm in the vaccine arm, because I got, that means that I'm getting, my body is building antibodies against COVID." So he was really excited. So from my perspective, this is relatively low side effect profile. And if you get side effects, that should make you excited that you are getting, your body's responding and building an immune response.
It's funny, but people should also be reassured that even if there's absolutely no reaction, you may still be protected. So, don't feel that you have to have a reaction to feel like you're immunized. I mean, I'll tell you funny stories. Like last year, before the coronavirus vaccine, because I'm advancing in my years, I decided to not just get my flu shot, I also got my shingles and pneumovax. So I did them all at the same time, which was maybe not the best idea, because you get the same kind of arm soreness and things like that, and you feel a little bit weaker and tired and things like that. But when you combine the 3 vaccines, my immune system just I was wiped out for a day. Now I was happy. Yes, I reacted, I'm getting immunized and things like that. But at the same time, as I said, if you don't have any reaction at all, the vaccine still works. But so I know there are people who are looking out for that reaction. Now, there are other side effects that people need to be aware of. So for example, if you go get a mammogram after the vaccination, you can get a little bit of lymph node swelling, and you want to make sure that whoever's reading the mammogram doesn't misread that as a sign of cancer, that the immune response is working, and that's why you see occasionally you can see a little bit more lymph nodes in the scan. So so those are just things to be aware of when you're thinking in terms of what are those kinds of side effects that you might see.
And to answer your question about efficacy, I think that you had that as part of your question. We talked about the 94, 95% after efficacy after your second dose of both Moderna and Pfizer. So those are the data. That's the data that came from some of the original studies. But now that we always think about, okay, what's the real world data? And we have examples from Israel. As you probably know, Israel is leading the world in terms of vaccination. And they probably have some of the best real live data available to the world. And in their studies, they showed that, that initial Pfizer number of 95% for symptomatic disease is actually 97%. And the efficacy of not getting infected and being asymptomatic is actually 94%. That's a piece of information we didn't have before. Before, we didn't know whether someone can pass the disease and be asymptomatic after vaccination. But now we know that the efficacy of the vaccine for asymptomatic disease is 94%, which is really, really high.
And I think the really important bottom line is that even for the rare cases that do get it after vaccination with the Pfizer and Moderna, even the rare cases that can actually get infected, there's essentially 0% chance of dying or having severe disease and hospitalization.
Definitely. I think there's so many things we need to consider when we're approaching our thoughts with the vaccine. I think now we'd like to move on to the reopening of, or the potential reopening of UC Riverside in the fall. I think that's something big that most of us are excited about, but how can we approach the faculty, staff, and students who may be against receiving the vaccine?
Well, I can tell you that that's a topic that's being heavily discussed right now. I don't think any decisions have been made in any front. What our goal is at UCR Health is to make sure that that all the people that are interested in getting vaccines can have a vaccine available to them. And that's what we continue to have our Friday. Initially were the Friday flu clinics, and now they're the Friday COVID clinics. And we've provided over 4,000 vaccines to our community, and we continue to be open until we either stop getting a supply of vaccines or we stop getting interest from our communities. But it's a topic that is being actively discussed. What is the summer going to look like? What is the fall going to look like? Many moving pieces, as you can imagine. Still lots of discussion as to how we operationalize that.
The related thing, I mean, to put it into context, is that, anybody who has school-age children knows that those kids can't go to school unless they've gotten their hepatitis vaccines, the series of vaccines. And that's basically for the safety and protection of the other kids in the school. And in that context, the question of getting vaccinated before you come to campus shouldn't be viewed as big an obstacle in terms of, we are protecting the other students and staff and faculty if you get the vaccination. And so it's really a matter of, if there's concern about not getting vaccinated, then, do you care about the others on the campus?
Definitely. I agree with that. Thank you, Dr. Lowe and Dr. Gonzalez, for answering those questions for us. Now we'd actually like to move on to our Q&A portions. We do have a few questions that our attendees have submitted, so we'd like to move on to that portion. Our first question is from Celine Tellez. Her question is, a few of my older family members have been hesitant to get vaccinated because they think that fetal cells were used to develop these vaccines. Is this true?
Well, actually, no. I mean, as I mentioned, especially like with the Pfizer and Moderna, there's a classic examples of, as I said, they isolated the virus in a week, got the full genome sequence, and they just simply used biochemistry and engineering to synthesize big vats of this, and they use like lipid mycels and things like that. So at no point were actual stem cells or fetal cells or anything like that used in the development or manufacture of those vaccines. I think there are reasons why rumors like that get spread, because it, appeals to the alarm and the fact that decades ago, some of the vaccines did involve some experimental research that involved various kinds of cells, and some of them did include stem cells and fetal cells and so on. But the present vaccines, I mean, we're using modern techniques and methods, and so we don't need to use those kinds of early tools for the development of the modern vaccine. So it's kind of like, these rumors from old histories.
Sounds good. Thank you for answering that question, Dr. Lowe. Our next question for either Dr. Lowe or Dr. Gonzalez, whoever would like to answer, is should individuals who are immune compromised, i.e. going through chemo treatments, get the vaccinations? If not, what time is recommended after treatment has fully ended for them to be safe to get it?
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, this is a tricky one. If you're immune compromised, you're basically not going to respond to the vaccine either. And some discussion is, there are monoclonal antibodies that are available. Most of the hospitals have these. And there's thought that maybe to provide some protection for those patients, instead of, it's basically called passive immunization, because you're basically giving them the antibodies rather than asking them to trigger their own immune system to make the antibodies. I don't know how well the guidelines have been developed on that. It's basically the antibodies are there to treat people who have been acutely infected. But in terms of providing the antibodies to protect people from potentially getting infected, I don't know. Dr. Gonzalez has maybe some better information on that.
Yeah. So what our typical approach is we ask most of these people that are immunocompromised. They usually have a physician that's following them for one condition or another. So we usually ask them to ask their physician who understands it, because the word immunocompromised has quite a span of if you have cancer, if you're in treatment, you might be immunocompromised, but there's various degrees and depth of being immunocompromised. And so we usually do is we ask the patients to ask their physicians whether they should get vaccinated or not. That's our typical approach.
Thank you for answering that question, Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Lowe. Our next question is, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of the Pfizer versus the Moderna versus the Johnson & Johnson vaccines? Is one considered more effective than the other?
So my answer is really clear. And I think Dr. Lowe alluded to that at the beginning. The two things that you're concerned about is getting really, really sick, getting hospitalized, or dying. And all three are 100% effective at those three. So to me, all three fall into the category. They're the same. They're both as good into the primary goals that any vaccine should have and any individual should have for protecting themselves or their loved ones.
I mean, I completely agree. And I think the distraction is that each of those vaccines was tested under different conditions at different times. And so people are tagged onto, you know, this efficacy number, that efficacy number, and things like that. And they're really not directly comparable, because when people do design of clinical trials, they ask different types of questions and do different measures. And so those numbers aren't equivalent from one trial to the next. And so as Dr. Gonzalez said, is like they are all the same in the sense that you're basically 100% protected from dying, hospitalization, serious disease.
Thank you both for answering the question. We have another question from the attendees saying that they heard that the administrators of the drug are not responsible for any long-term effects. Is it true or not?
Oh, that's a good question. I knew there was going to be a challenging question coming up. You know, honestly, I have not read in depth deeply about that topic. I know that there's some protections conferred through the emergency use authorization to some of the manufacturers. I also know that there's some fund from the government for individuals, but that's the extent of my knowledge. Something that I've not looked into in detail, but that's what I've come across.
There is actually a federal fund that was created in this, I think is in the 70s. And it was basically a fund that the government set up to basically reassure the drug companies that if they developed a vaccine, that they wouldn't be fully liable for any of these extremely rare events. But if you tried to say, oh my gosh, I was harmed by the vaccine, it then requires really extensive investigation to see whether there really was an adverse event that could be attributed to the vaccine. And in the decades since this fund was created, I think there's basically been a small handful of cases where any kind of damages were awarded. And it's an important kind of balance question, because if the drug companies are afraid that they are going to be sued into oblivion because of some rare accidental correlation, then drug companies would never bother to develop the vaccines, and then we all lose. And so the fund was created really to basically encourage businesses to say, well, there's a greater global public benefit in developing the vaccines, and the unusual rare, I mean, it's almost like, you know, it's like when you're examining somebody for sainthood, you know, it's like, are these rare events really attributed to what we think they are? And I think that the success of that fund in terms of encouraging vaccine development, as well as the fact that it's just been so extraordinarily rare that real true damage has been done that's really caused by the vaccine, it's really an encouraging thing to think about.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe and Dr. Gonzalez. The next question we have is a combination of two questions from the attendees. A few of them have been able to get the second vaccine in a timely order. So they waited past the 3 weeks, or they weren't able to schedule a time in the manner. Can they take it after the 3 weeks? And how should they proceed with getting a vaccine after the appropriate time has passed?
Yeah, there's different times for different manufacturers. So for the Pfizer is 3 weeks, for the Moderna is 4 weeks. You can still get the second shot up to 6 weeks, and that's the kind of the guideline we have right now. Could it be longer? Could that be extended? That I don't think we have an answer, but currently that's the guideline that we have. Beyond the 6 weeks, a question comes in whether you need to get the 2 shots again, and that's something that's still being discussed. Is there another portion to the question?
I guess there isn't, but we can move on if Dr.
Dr.
Lowe.
Lowe, any comments on that?
No, I think that covers, yeah.
So our next question is from Marco, and he's asking, should religious viewpoints against getting vaccinated be respected?
Great question, and I think we have similar, we deal with something similar with flu vaccine. I think we, as an institution, as a large UC institution, we have to decide how we're gonna handle, the kind of exemptions that we're gonna give for our population. I think that question is beyond my pay grade. But I believe that it's part of the answer as an organization. How do we want to handle this? And there's probably going to be some medical exemptions. And there's going to be some. If you're allergic to some of the components, we know that the vaccine is contraindicated. Just like Dr. Lowe had mentioned for flu vaccine, and if you have egg allergies, that could be a contraindication. In the case of UCR, we bought a flu vaccine that had no eggs in it. So that way that was not a contraindication, but there were other contraindications. So the question of whether you have a contraindication or medical contraindication or or you need a religious accommodation or some other kind of HR accommodation, that's something that needs to be discussed as a UC, as a larger institution.
Okay, so I'm gonna go into the religious question. So I think it's worth discussing, because I was raised Catholic, and I know enough about the church to know that not everybody even practices Catholicism in the same way. And so religious commitment and belief is still an individual question. And even in the Catholic Church, I point out that our Pope has advocated for getting any vaccine you can get a hold of, whereas the American Conference of Catholic Bishops has a little bit more iffy kind of view on the question of vaccines. And so if you're a Catholic, who do you follow? Your bishop or your Pope, right? And so again, it's still left to the individual to decide your own faith and how you practice. And as I said earlier about the question of vaccines, is your moral faith focused on these various questions of the origins of the vaccines versus the society question? Do you have a responsibility to your fellow humans? Is the benefit of the vaccination viewed in terms of I have a commitment to my other fellow humans, and so protecting my fellows, neighbors, family, and things like that may be one way of viewing that question of the vaccination. But it's up to the individuals to decide that. And because even in the context of one faith or another faith, you may still come to a different conclusion.
Definitely. Well, thank you both for answering those questions, and thank you to all of our attendees for asking those questions. That will now conclude the question portion of this event. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank our speakers, Dr. Lowe and Dr. Gonzalez, as well as UCR Healthy Campus and the School of Medicine for hosting this insightful webinar. We really hope this webinar was as informative for you as it was for us. And just a reminder, all individuals 16 and older are now eligible to receive the vaccine, and we highly encourage you to do so to protect yourself and your loved ones. You can visit campusreturn.ucr.edu for more information on scheduling an appointment for the vaccine. Thank you to our audience members for attending this event once again today, and have a great rest of your evening, everyone. We really appreciate you coming out today.
Thanks for the questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.